Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on environmental science, and specifically going through insect anatomy part 1. Let's get started on this next video. So before we jump into anatomy, we have to understand what an insect is. And an insect is a small arthropod or animal that has 6 legs and generally 1 or 2 pairs of wings. So when we think of insects, you might think of a dragonfly, maybe a praying mantis, or maybe even a ladybug. But our goal for today is to go through and connect this to anatomy. And anatomy is the branch of science concerned with the bodily structure of humans, animals, or other living organisms. And what we're going to be going through is dissecting our lanternflies and looking at the anatomy of those insects. So we have to go through and classify insects based on our orders here. So an insect is in the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Arthropoda, and then the class Hexapoda. Now, it depends on what insect we have for the order, the family, the genus, and the species. And this is something that we will be going through and looking at when we delve into the lanternfly. But it's important for us to know the kingdom, the phylum, and the class. We have Animalia, Arthropoda, and Hexapoda. So let's go through and jump into the anatomy of an insect. An insect is going to consist of 3 fundamental and main parts. The first part is going to be the head, and that's going to be the first part that we're going to go through and see in this diagram and see on that insect. The second is going to be the thorax. This is this middle section in the insect. And then lastly, we have the abdomen. And then within each of these 3 subsets of the insect, what we're going to see are different structures that are associated with the function and the ability for the organism to survive. Now on the head, we're going to see a couple of things. We're going to see a compound eye, and we're also going to see these ocelli. And these ocelli are going to be very primitive eyes. The compound eye is going to be a little bit more complex. Ocelli are going to be more primitive light sensing organs that allow the bug to go through and interact with its environment. And we're also going to see mouth parts on these insects, antenna, and there's going to be different sets of these mouth parts. We're going to go through and talk about each of these sponges, the mandibles, all these mouth parts that exist for different organs. And then obviously we have the legs of that organism going through and protruding out of the thorax. Now on the thorax, we're going to potentially see wings. And these wings are going to enable these organisms to go through and fly. And then on the abdomen, we're going to see these spiracles, which are going to enable the organism to go through respiration. Now, the last thing that we're going to go through and talk about are some reproductive parts, the ovipositor, which is going to be important for going through and laying eggs. And this is important for us to understand when discussing lanternflies. So these are going to be the parts that we're going to go through in detail. And we're going to go through and discuss and look at this in our lab. So let's go through and start off with the head here. The head is going to be the anterior most part of the insect's body, and it's going to be hard and highly sclerotized. And this compact structure is going to consist of 6 segments that are fused to form this head capsule. So if we go through and look at this fly head, what we see are, 1, the most obvious things here. We see a compound eye, and then on the top we have these ocelli, which we'll go through and talk about. But what we can do in anatomy is we can break it up into sections. This part of the head we're going to call the frons. This part we're going to call the gena. And then this is going to be the mouth parts. And the mouth parts are going to depend upon how the organism has evolved and what its primary food source is. So as we go through and look at mouth parts here, well, the first mouth part that we're going to see are these mandibles. And these mandibles are primarily used for chewing. The second type of mouth part that we're going to see are sponges, and these are going to be used for sponging. We're going to generally see these on flies. And then the last one is the proboscis, and this is a modified mandible and maxilla, and it's used for siphoning. So if we look at each of these organisms here, we can see that different organisms have different purposes and function and different food sources. If we look all the way on the right here, we have this fly, and this fly is going to go through and use its sponge to go through and sift through food sources that it would go through and consume. We can see second from the right, it's going to be a butterfly or some sort of moth. It's going to have this long proboscis, which is going to be used for siphoning nectar. Now, third from the right, we're going to see this piercing or suckling. And this is going to be something that we're generally going to see in mosquitoes. And really all it is a modified proboscis. But generally for mosquitoes or other organisms that are going to feed off of the blood of other animals, they're going to use this piercing or sucking mouth part. And then lastly, we have these mandibles or these chewing mouth parts here. And these are going to be important for organisms and insects that go through and either consume other insects or consume plant matter. So those mandibles are going to allow them to go through and break off chunks of plants or other insects or other animals, and it's going to allow them to go through and feed on them. And we briefly talked about the ocelli, but the ocelli are simple photoreceptors. Think of them as primitive eyes that just go through and detect light. They only consist of a single lens, and we can see there are 3 of them up here on this insect. We can see that they are much smaller and much simpler compared to this compound eye. And really what they're going to enable organisms to do is sense different types of light sources that maybe our human eye wouldn't be able to see. Things like ultraviolet radiation. But these ocelli are going to be important for organisms, especially bees and butterflies that go through and feed off of nectar, because it allows them to go through and identify parts of those flowers where the nectar is. Now, another structure that we're going to see on insects are these antennae. And sometimes they're referred to as feelers, and they're pairs of appendages that are used for sensing. So we can see on this insect here, we have these very fancy, very intricate antennae. We have these antennae here on this insect here, this honeybee. And we also are going to see antennae on crustaceans, because crustaceans are actually related to insects and close on the phylogenetic tree. But remember, these antennae are going to allow the insects to go through and feel around their environment. They're very sensitive organs. And as they go through and feel around, they're going to generate more data and information on their environment and complete whatever task that they have at hand. So in the case of bees, they're going to use them to go through, get to the center of the flower where the pollen and the nectar are at. And it's going to allow the bees to go through and find the nectar deep within the plant. Now, the thorax is going to be this middle section of the organism, and this is behind the head but before the abdomen. And this is generally where we see the legs and the wings if they are present. So if we look at this grasshopper here, what we can actually see is here's our thorax. This is this middle section of that grasshopper, and we actually see all 6 of the legs attached to this thorax section here. Now, we can actually break the thorax into 3 separate parts here. We're going to have the pro, mesa, and meta sections of the thorax. And when we go through and discuss legs and wing structures, there are going to be specific parts of the thorax where we're going to see them grow. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop here. We're going to enable you to kind of go back, look at this video, and kind of absorb the information before delving into the next video. It's going to be really important for you to go through and look at this information and really solidify this in your mind before going through and completing the lab.